Hello, Andrew here. Welcome to Lecture 3 in the Using Creative Multimedia for Youth Engagement module. This lecture will be on feminist discourse in digital multimedia. Now, as I kind of said in the last lecture, the next four, this one included feminist discourse, race discourse, queer discourse, and development discourse in digital multimedia, will be all we can really hope to expect because it's such a broad topics with multiple sort of layers of meaning and significance and prominence in different areas. So all I really want to do here is frame as much of the historical context through kind of current movements and that to show where it's come from and to, and then, kind of indicate where it may be heading in some regards. So that's all this is really. So just think of that as like a disclaimer up front about it, that it's, there's going to be holes in this in terms of how comprehensive it is. But I just want to give a firm enough snapshot of the developments within each of these different sort of movements, and in terms of advocacy or advocating on behalf of minority groups and how all that representation has happened in multimedia, both for good and for bad throughout history. So that's just to kind of put that up front there, that this will not be exhaustive in terms of what will be covered, but we'll just kind of go through it that way. And if there's any questions of what might be missing or lacking or any comments on that, please do come back to me, and I'll fill in that as much as possible. Okay, so if we want to do kind of a snapshot breakdown of the history of the feminist movement, we'd have what's commonly known as the waves of feminism, and that have happened historically up to present day, from the first wave from 1830s to 1900s, second wave from the 1960s to about the 1980s, and the third wave from the 1990s onwards. And just one where it's not a kind of hard and fast sort of definite split in that, but they're just kind of broad umbrellas in terms of chronologies to look at the history of feminist movement through. In terms of the third wave and kind of leading towards into the future, I'm looking at, I'm just going to look at, say, post-feminism, radical, speculative feminism, ecofeminism, and post-gender, just to kind of give a snapshot. But again, like I said, that's not the exhaustive list. So if we look at the first wave, with women's fight for equal contract and property rights. So this is where, from in the late 19th to early 20th centuries, women realized that they first must gain political power, including the right to vote, to bring about those changes. And the political agenda expanded to issues concerning sexual, reproductive, and economic rights, and planting the seed overall to just acknowledge mostly that they have the potential and do contribute just as much as men to society. So that's where the kind of seeds were sown with that. And we've had like the 100 years, the centenary of the suffragette movement, for example, which is kind of happening currently, which is kind of an interesting frame to look back throughout the history of women's fight for equal rights. And yeah, I'll bring that in later on in a different sort of a guise, just to discuss that. In terms of the second wave, it's coming off the heels mostly of the Second World War, and focusing on women in the workplace, where during the war effort, where men were off fighting, women were introduced into the workplaces and excelled as such. And naturally, when men returned and women were in place in the workplace, there was instantly room to expand on that sort of understanding of social roles, and just how things had been reorganized so seismically, kind of in the shadow of the world wars, I suppose. And again, you see the constant themes of sexuality, family, and reproductive rights carrying throughout this. And there was a time when, in the US in particular, they were trying to, the country was trying to restructure itself, and was perceived that women had met their equality goals, with the exception of the failure of the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, which still hasn't kind of come to pass. But, you know, so just to show that a lot of these issues are like threads that have carried throughout and do join a lot of these somewhat disparate elements of feminism or different perceptions of it throughout up to the current day. But essentially, all would posit themselves opposite a patriarchy. If we look at it as broadly as that and then see where we go from there. In terms of the third wave, today, from 1990s to present, unlike the former movements, the term feminist is received less critically because it's just kind of it somewhat assimilated itself into cultures, and it's a case that, you know, it incorporating a varying degree of feminist outlooks. You know, as I said, these are post-feminism, radfem, speculative feminism, ecofeminism, post-gender, post-humanism. I suppose we even extend it that far, but likewise into ego-cultural feminism and just general liberal reforms of academic sort of spheres of professional classes and all this sort of, you know, everything kind of in somewhat way has kind of splintered and attached itself to, you know, bespoke sort of areas, all kind of still combining under a, you know, the broader term of feminism, really. So we can kind of hold it in that. But if we wanted to kind of come up with a theory for this third wave, it would be the theory of the political, economic, and social equality of the sexes. So as broad as that may seem, you know, that kind of is the loosest kind of catch-all that we could put over the whole of feminist movement throughout its history. So in terms of this lecture, what we want to really focus in on is the sort of the media perceptions of women, essentially, and then of the feminist movement, and just to see how we can kind of expand on that and break that out, you know. So if we look at Rosalind Gill's kind of written quite a bit on this, as there are others, but I've kind of focused on Gill's kind of take on it, where it kind of feeds into, you know, a late capitalism or neoliberal model in terms of postmodernism and how everything can and should be objectified and can put into some sort of like consumable form of it, really. So that's what I'll get at that framing later on. But in general, it does point to the fact that, you know, you'd really have to ask yourself the question of how much of this sort of definition or redefining of women and their roles in society, or how they are perceived in society, has happened outside of media throughout the history. So, you know, I'll just read this quote and then expand on that a little bit. One of the things that makes the media today very different from the television, magazines, radio, or press of the 1960s, 70s, and early 80s is that feminism is now part of the cultural field. That is, feminist discourses are expressed within the media rather than being external, independent, critical voices. Feminist inspires ideas burst forth from our radios, television screens, and print media, in TV discussions about date rape and sexualized imagery, in newspaper articles about women's experiences of war, or the increasing beauty pressures on young girls, in talk shows about domestic violence or anorexia. Indeed, it might be argued that much of what counts as feminist debate in Western countries today takes place in the media rather than outside of it. Okay, so, you know, that's, I wanted to include that because there is a lot of truism in there of, you know, as I said, the role of women and the perception of women and how they are portrayed through the media or through visual arts in particular, which we'll get at in the next video. But also just kind of to flag something which will probably be discussed in sort of, you know, a lecture on the perception of development and, you know, more indigenous ways of looking at you know, how societies form, that this is kind of mostly around Western civilization and Western countries, I suppose. So just to kind of include that little caveat there, because, you know, there are forms of matriarchal societies and in more indigenous sort of specific ways. And then if we look towards post-humanism or towards post-gender, you know, where there's, we'll talk about it a little bit later as well, of the, you know, the comparative or the, you know, the blending of it with the natural world, essentially, and how other creatures or animals kind of form their social structures and how that happens. And there's a lot of kind of learning to happen out of that. But just in the broadest sense, to just take on this media concept of how women are portrayed and then how this is internalized or portrayed, women see themselves. This is kind of an interesting first that we want to look at here. So I'm going to show a first short video, which is John Berger writing about the male gaze and the female nude.
Men dream of women. Women dream of themselves being dreamt of. Men look at women. Women watch themselves being looked at. Women constantly meet glances which act like mirrors, reminding them of how they look or how they should look. Behind every glance is a judgment. Sometimes the glance they meet is their own, reflected back from a real mirror. A woman is always accompanied, except when quite alone, perhaps even then, by her own image of herself. While she is walking across a room, or weeping at the death of her father, she cannot avoid envisaging herself walking or weeping. From earliest childhood, she is taught and persuaded to survey herself continually. She has to survey everything she is and everything she does, because how she appears to others, and particularly how she appears to men, is of crucial importance for what is normally thought of as the success of her life. A woman in the culture of privileged Europeans is first and foremost a sight to be looked at. What kind of sight is revealed in the average European oil painting? There were portraits of women as there were portraits of men, but in one category of painting, women were the principal, ever-recurring subject. That category was the nude. In the nudes of European painting, we can discover some of the criteria and conventions by which women were judged. We can see how women were seen. What then is a nude? In his book on the nude, Kenneth Clark says that being naked is simply being without clothes. The nude, according to him, is a form of art. I would put it differently. To be naked is to be oneself. To be nude is to be seen naked by others and yet not recognized for oneself. A nude has to be seen as an object in order to be a nude. In the European oil painting, nakedness is not taken for granted, as in archaic art. Nakedness is a sight for those who are dressed. That is why Manet's painting, which really marks the end of the period I'm considering, is so profound a comment on all the works which preceded it.
Okay, so just that little snapshot, as with the other videos I'm going to show, are just to kind of build a little mosaic of the area we want to talk within. But the main point there, the crucial one, being this sort of historical objectification of women as an object, and for women to embody that role, or, you know, and the amount of like other levels of you know, behavior, consciousness, awareness, and perception of themselves and of each other, and likewise with a male gaze looking at the same things, all sort of really pointing to you know, kind of a hidden truth within society. So I just want to show two other quick videos just to show how these sort of grammars have been you know, applied to digital media or other medias, really, and how this sort of woman as object, or woman opposite a male gaze or a male perception of the world being the vital thing. So we'll show these other two videos really quick and then come back and kind of expand on all those areas.
Grade 5 news cameras rolling. That recorded sound is slated for
Okay, just a quick note on that. Just the, you know, the point that I suppose the irony or possible hypocrisy of, you know, care and beauty products for women kind of co-opting that sensibility, or a political feminist sort of interpretation of this notion of beauty and how it is put across, and putting that central to, you know, an ad campaign to sell women beauty or care products like that, isn't something that we can't really ignore about watch there. We'll talk about how enhanced and how unrealistic that concept of beauty is after this, when we watch the next one, just to give the grammar.
The Bechdel test, or the Mo movie measure, is a type of litmus test to assess the presence of women in movies. It originated from Alison Bechdel's comic Dykes to Watch Out For in 1985. Here's how it works. A movie just has to pass these three simple questions. The first, are there two or more women in it who have names? The second, do they talk to each other? And the third, do they talk to each other about something other than a man? It's quite extraordinary, actually, how many movies don't pass this test, because it's not even a sign of whether it's a feminist movie or whether it's a good movie, just that there's female presence in it and that they actually are engaging about things other than men. To prove that this is actually a systemic problem and not just a few movies here and there, I'm going to show you a couple films that don't pass the test. Okay, you get the point. This is only just a few films out of the many films that don't pass this test, When I call it a systemic problem, what I mean by this is that it's not just a few people here and there that don't like women or don't want women's stories told, but that rather the entire industry is built upon creating films and movies that cater to and that are about men. Next time you go to the movies, just ask yourself these few questions. Are there 2 or more women in it, and do they have names? Do they talk to each other? And do they talk to each other about something other than a man?
Okay, and as you can see from that video, it's quite stark and startling how absent a lot of the, those issues are, and that's a really interesting kind of litmus test to run on films in particular. What the 2 videos just there point to is this sort of industrial taking of that. Like basically we're talking about like classic the Hollywood narrative essentially having a total absence of women and female perspective or feminine perspectives within their films. And you'd have to instantly ask yourself how much of a reality does that reflect. But likewise, just at an industrial level, to see the exclusion of female stories from the main grammar that we have in terms of cinema and multimedia sort of storytelling. We talk about how that has been taken up with games now in a minute, but that combined with this unrealistic image or perception of the ideal woman or what should be, perceived as beauty, and how augmented that is, and how unrealistic, and how unattainable, or mostly how unrealistic that is, because it is an imposed perception really, and this sort of an augmented version of that male gaze, I suppose. So I just want to kind of talk about you bring it through to what would be a grammar within cinema, and how that has, how that was formed post-war, if we look at it in the frame of like second wave feminism in the classical Hollywood narrative in the form of the film noir, where you had this split, and then on the right we have Rosie the Riveter, which would have come after, in terms of an effort for women working in the women in the workplace during the war, and how that has kind of, it applies to this image is quite a famous one, which has been adapted numerous times to represent working women, and more broadly, women overcoming adversity, and also to kind of, embolden like proto-feminist messages really with that. So this kind of duality cropped up straight after the war of like the actuality of women in a workplace working, and this sort of attaining employment rights, and being seen as equals, or in a lot of cases better than men in these sort of work environments. And then on the left, the post-war image of men returning from the war zones, and returning back to a changed society, and this sort of suspicion of women, which is never more clear than in the film noirs, where you had this sort of a woman who is independent, and could potentially, well, the storylines would often revolve around a male protagonist who is lured to his downfall by a beautiful yet dangerous two-timing woman, femme fatale. These women use their sexuality to control and manipulate a man into doing what she wants, and it's generally some a moral act or a crime that will benefit her while implicating him. The narratives would also kind of include, the femme fatale is that she would be punished by the end of it, and to contrast that femme fatale character, there was this sort of idealistic double of a pure virtuous woman with good intentions. And, these kind of archetypes or sort of tropes started to arrive then, and, sublimate themselves into the cinema at the time, and into the broader sort of culture. And, this obviously having a pretty, drastic knock-on effect on that sort of, perceptions of what the second wave feminism was doing, or, in terms of the theory and the sort of the political action that was coming around that, contrasting with this sort of broader cinematic example of women, and this sort of container or containing this sort of these new roles that women were emerging into in cultures and societies. So we'll go back to another video just to look at this sort of the tropes that would have arrived out of that, and how mostly just to kind of put it next to newer media in terms of games and stuff like that, because a lot of the film grammar and storylines and tropes has carried on into gaming. So it'll bring us kind of up to speed to where we might be at today in terms of the perceptions and roles of women.
Of course, the damsel in distress predates the invention of video games by several thousand years. The trope can be traced back to ancient Greek mythology with the tale of Perseus. According to the myth, Andromeda is about to be devoured by a sea monster after being chained naked to a rock as human sacrifice. Perseus slays the beast, rescues the princess, and then claims her as his wife. In the Middle Ages, the damsel in distress was a common feature in many medieval songs, legends, and fairy tales. The saving of a defenseless woman was often portrayed as the raison d'être, or reason for existence, in romance tales and poems of the era, involving a knight-errant, the wandering knight adventuring to prove his chivalry, prowess, and virtue. At the turn of the 20th century, victimized young women became the cliché of choice for the nascent American film industry, as it provided an easy and sensational plot device for the silver screen. A famous early example is the 1913 Keystone Cops short Barney Oldfield's Race for a Life, which features the now iconic scene of a woman being tied to the railroad tracks by an evil, mustache-twirling villain. Around the same time, the motif of a giant monkey carrying away a screaming woman began to gain widespread popularity in media of all kinds. Notably, Tarzan's love interest, Jane, is captured by a brutish primate in Edgar Rice Burroughs' 1912 pulp adventure, Tarzan and the Apes. In 1930, Walt Disney used this meme in an early Mickey Mouse cartoon called The Gorilla Mystery. The imagery was even exploited by the U.S. military in this recruitment poster for World War I. But it was in 1933 that two things happened, which 50 years later would set the stage for the damsel in distress trope to become a foundational element in video games as a medium. First, Paramount Pictures introduced their animated series Popeye the Sailor to cinema audiences. The formula for most shorts would involve Popeye rescuing a kidnapped Hollywood. Second, in March of that year, RKO Pictures releases its groundbreaking hit film King Kong, in which a giant ape abducts a young woman and is eventually killed while trying to keep possession of her. Fast forward to 1981, when a Japanese company named Nintendo entrusted a young designer named Shigeru Miyamoto with the task of creating a new arcade game for the American market. Originally, the project was conceived of as a game starring Popeye the Sailor. But when Nintendo wasn't able to secure the rights, Miyamoto created his own characters to fill the void, heavily influenced by the movie King Kong. The game's hero Jumpman was tasked with rescuing a damsel named the Lady after she's carried off by a giant ape. In later versions, she's renamed Pauline. Although Donkey Kong is perhaps the most famous early arcade game to feature the damsel in distress, it wasn't the first time Miyamoto employed the trope. 2 years earlier, he had a hand in designing a 1979 arcade game called Sheriff. In it, a vague female-shaped collection of pixels, referred to as the Beauty, must be rescued from a pack of bandits. The hero is then rewarded with a smooch of victory for his bravery in the end. A few years later, Miyamoto recycled his Donkey Kong character designs. Pauline became the template for a new damsel named Princess Toadstool, and Jumpman became a certain very famous plumber Princess Peach is in many ways the quintessential stock character version of the damsel in distress. The ill-fated princess appears in 14 of the core Super Mario Bros. Platformer games, and she's kidnapped in 13 of them. The North American release of Super Mario Bros. 2 in 1988 remains the only game in the core series in which Peach is not kidnapped, and also the only game in which she's a playable character. Though it should be noted, it wasn't originally created to be a Mario game at all. The game was originally released in Japan under a completely different title called Yumi Kojo Doki Doki Panic, which roughly translates to Dream Factory Heart-Pounding Panic. Nintendo of America thought that the original Japanese release of Super Mario Bros. 2 was too difficult and too similar to the first game, so they reskinned and redesigned Doki Doki Panic to star Mario and Luigi instead. However, the Japanese game already had 4 playable characters, so the designers opted to include Toad and the Princess to fill the 2 remaining slots, building directly on top of the pre-existing character models. So really, if we're honest, Peach is kinda accidentally playable in this one. Still, she had the awesome ability to float for short distances, which came in really handy, especially in the ice levels. Sadly, Peach has never been a playable character again in the main franchise. Even with newer games that feature 4 player options like the new Super Mario Bros. Wii and Wii U, the princess is still excluded from the action. She's been replaced with another Toad instead, as to allow Nintendo to force her back into the damsel role again and again. Peach does of course appear in many spin-offs such as the Mario Party, Mario Sports, and Mario Kart series, as well as the Super Smash Bros. Nintendo Universe crossover fighting games. However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers. She is the star of only one adventure, and we'll get to that a little later.
Okay, so just, yeah, that kind of, mostly just wanted to impress this sort of the kind of received, the inherited wisdom or the inherited grammar of, you know, cinematic tropes and structures, be it on one side the femme fatale character and then on this side the damsel in distress, taken from a historical context and applied to cinema, and then that grammar being reapplied to games or new media really. And just we want to kind of get at how you know, how little has changed in one way like that. There are games that are examples, and games are probably one of the main areas where this kind of repurposing of, you know, the feminist perspective is happening faster than it has done in any other media form, probably quicker than it has in any other media form or continues to do. Again, we'll talk about that in a little while. But I just want to kind of get under the bonnet with this, just in terms of, to kind of harken back to what we discussed in the previous lecture of looking at, you know, internalizing a lot of these sort of representations in society. And, you know, this being a vital part, which we kind of talked about, of how much of, you know, the feminist movement or feminism has happened outside of this visual, you know, a visual culture, if we look at it as the broadest way. So I'll just, again, this is from one of Rosalind Gill's papers, where I just want to, we'll use this to frame what we're going to talk about next. One of the most striking examples of post-feminist media culture is its obsessional preoccupation with the body. In a shift from earlier representational practices, it appears that femininity is defined as a bodily property rather than, say, a social, structural, or psychological one. Instead of caring or nurturing or motherhood being regarded as central to femininity, all of course highly problematic and exclusionary, in today's media it is possession of a sexy body that is presented as a woman's key, if not sole, source of identity. The body is presented simultaneously as women's source of power, and as always already unruly and requiring a constant monitoring, surveillance, discipline and remodeling, and consumer spending, which is where I want to go next with this, in order to conform to ever narrower judgments of female attractiveness. So literally we're just looking at that, how much of that then has to become internalized and taken, you know, in the form of you know, as a reality, an internal reality as much as like an external sort of perception, or, you know, that perceived reality. So again, you know, this is all a little bit cyclical, where it's jumping back and forth. So I just want to build up a kind of a mosaic of these elements rather than giving some sort of hard and fast chronological history to that. And one of the vital things is this sort of relationship with the you know, a kind of a psychological link to you know, to body and mind and that perception of it, and how much of that has happened in terms of, you know, consumption or to drive consumer spending. So I'm just going to go back on that a little bit and then we'll come back again.
Bernays returned to New York and set up as a public relations counsel in a small office off Broadway. It was the first time the term had ever been used. Since the end of the 19th century, America had become a mass industrial society, with millions clustered together in the cities. Bernays was determined to find a way to manage and alter the way these new crowds thought and felt. To do this, he turned to the writings of his uncle Sigmund. While in Paris, Bernays had sent his uncle a gift of some Havana cigars. In return, Freud had sent him a copy of his General Introduction to Psychoanalysis. Bernays read it, and the picture of hidden irrational forces inside human beings fascinated him. He wondered whether he might make money by manipulating the unconscious.
What Eddie got from Freud was indeed this idea that there is a lot more going on in human decision-making, not only among individuals, but even more importantly among groups, than this idea that information drives behavior. And so Eddie began to formulate this idea that you had to look at things that would play to people's irrational emotions. And you see, that moved Eddie immediately into a different category from other people in his field and most government officials and managers of the day who thought if you just hit people with all this factual information, they would look at that and say, oh, of course. And Eddie knew that was not the way the world worked.
Bernays set out to experiment with the minds of the popular classes. His most dramatic experiment was to persuade women to smoke. At that time, there was a taboo against women smoking, and one of his early clients, George Hill, the president of the American Tobacco Corporation, asked Bernays to find a way of breaking it.
He said, we're losing half of our market because men have invoked a taboo against women smoking in public. Can you do anything about that? I said, let me think about it. And then I said, have I your permission to see a psychoanalyst to find out what cigarettes mean to women? He said, what'll it cost? So I called up Dr. Brill, A.A. Brill, who was a leading psychoanalyst in New York at that time.
How come you didn't call your uncle? Why didn't you call your uncle?
Because he was in Vienna.
A.A. Brill was one of the first psychoanalysts in America, and for a large fee he told Bernays that cigarettes were a symbol of the penis and of male sexual power. He told Bernays that if he could find a way to connect cigarettes with the idea of challenging male power, then women would smoke, because then they would have their own penises. Every year, New York held an Easter Day parade to which thousands came, and Bernays decided to stage an event there. He persuaded a group of rich debutantes to hide cigarettes under their clothes. Then they should join the parade, and at a given signal from him, they were to light up the cigarettes dramatically. Bernays then informed the press that he had heard that a group of suffragettes were preparing to protest by lighting up what they called torches of freedom.
He knew this would be an outcry, and he knew that all of the photographers would be there to capture this moment. And so he was ready with a phrase, which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch. You see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world. And from that point forward, the sale of cigarettes to women began to rise. He had made them socially acceptable with a single symbolic act.
What Bernays had created was the idea that if a woman smoked, it made her more powerful and independent, an idea that still persists today.
Embrace me, my sweet embrace.
It made him realize that it was possible to persuade people to behave irrationally if you link products to their emotional desires and feelings. The idea that smoking actually made women freer was completely irrational, but it made them feel more independent. It meant that irrelevant objects could become powerful emotional symbols of how you wanted to be seen by others.
Eddie Bernays saw the way to sell product was not to sell it to your intellect, that you ought to buy an automobile, but that you will feel better about it if you have this automobile. I think he originated that idea, that they weren't just purchasing something, but they were engaging themselves emotionally or personally in the product or service. That it's not, you think you need a new piece of clothing, but you'll feel better with the piece of clothing. That was his contribution in a very real sense. We see it all over the place today, but I think he originated the idea of the emotional connect to a product or service.
Okay, kind of jumped into that one without much of a context around it. I was on another thought process, which will come into play now. But essentially, this one part of the story is Edward Bernays, the originator of PR, and his relationship with his uncle Sigmund Freud and Hannah Freud, his daughter as well, and how all this sort of combined to expand on this sort of creating needs and wants within a true, consumerism and, to sell products essentially. The vital one being this first one of how to sell something to women and how to build up some associative thing. The reason I wanted to include this was just to start explaining, describing that internalized take on it and having objects in the physical world which would begin to represent that. And mostly how that this is, as clearly stated here, that the PR in particular, but marketing and branding, co-opting all those elements of strong feminist movements which had happened in industrial equality in places like this, and just corporatizing feminism essentially, and corporatizing an idea, and that being, taking on all sensibilities with it, and present potentially like a pseudo experience of who you are and what you represent. The reason this was all, and continues to be, really appealing to industry and to advertising in particular, is that it can kind of load up all this sort of different conceptions and ambiguities about women and how they're perceived, taboos of that, the other, sort of this notion of an other almost, and a lack of, a want and a need, and even as far as the forbidden. So back to the nude and body and these sort of concepts, and put all that into one place really, so that we have, this idea of this pseudo experience where it looks like things are being discussed and, roles are being filled in public, and this being, and being mediated, but at the same breath, product being sold and things moving really, So as regards that, we want to look at these notions of choice really, and how they are put together, and how that has really underpinned a post-feminism, if we want to look at it that way, just to pick off this post-feminist notion where, the assumption is that all this is and has happened and has kind of come to pass already, and now that being oneself and pleasing oneself being central to that, and that being an expression of, of your feminist, your liberty as a woman, and, in terms of feminism having come to pass and delivered. And I just want to, we'll just pick up the first bit I've explained. They resonate powerfully with the emphasis upon empowerment and taking control that can be seen in talk shows, advertising, and makeover shows. A grammar of individualism underpins all these notions, such that even experiences of racism or homophobia or domestic violence are framed in exclusively personal terms, in a way that turns the idea of the personal as political on its head. Lois McNay has called this the deliberate reprivatization of issues that have only relatively recently become politicized. One aspect of this post-feminist sensibility in media culture is the almost total evacuation of notions of politics or cultural influence. This is seen not only in the relentless personalizing tendencies of news, talk shows, and reality TV, but also in the ways in which we in which every aspect of life is refracted through the idea of personal choice and self-determination. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of flag that sort of, historically there we've got this picture of PR building up this model and presenting an image of this deliberated woman who smokes, and smoking being an indicator of that liberation. But what we're looking at now is this sort of reprivatization of issues that have only recently become politicized. So, this basically points to everything being grist for the mill for a neoliberal sort of market-led ideology, and everything looking like it's a personal choice and self-determined. And, that's quite, we'll see this carrying across everything in relation to, we'll talk about youth culture and subcultures next, as we talked about before, and this concept of internalizing a lot of that, which has happened. But mostly I just want to really pick off how violent that is, I suppose is the word to put on, when it comes to women and their perception of themselves. So we can think of like famous examples like this, which, still hold up about, this notions of taboos or things that are like dirty or, obscene almost, or just cannot be broadcast, which is natural, very natural, straightforward things like, sanitary towel commercials using blue dye to replace menstrual blood. And this being, a really instant internalization that happens through this at the same time when trying to sell you a brand product. And, just the connotations that happen around this about things being dirty and unclean and, taboo, and all those things that have to be kind of assimilated and kind of put together in terms of a perception, a self-perception of how a woman has to look at herself when it comes to these sorts of, natural bodily functions, showing how sort of surreal in some ways this can get. So if we look at this in terms of, and I want to bring it right the way through to like the invisibility of one other side about like who people are and who women are, or how they, how that all fits together in terms of our understanding of these things, and how hidden a lot of that is, even though it's like, or how absent a lot of the discussion is in, and I suppose we could say that, where, it's mediated, it's mass mediated, it's pseudo kind of experience, and at the same time it's totally internalized, and then there's a big huge trough in the middle which is not discussed, or there's not even the studies, I suppose. This is what I want to kind of pull across here if we talk about youth culture and subculture, like we talked about in the last lecture about moral panics, and say the likes, is the absence or the invisibility of teenage girls on those fronts, and it's a case of, with possible exceptions of sexual deviance, women constituted an uncelebrated social category for radical and critical theorists. So there's no understanding of that, or, the role that younger women in particular have played in society throughout has kind of gone by the wayside. And yet it's, just all, something that can be sold, or in the form of glamour or beauty, or this self-determinist model is all that's really on offer now, and the popular press and media concentrating on sensational incidents associated with each of these cultures, and mostly women being, excluded in some senses from the violent aspects of that, as we talked about in the moral panic. So not really being, kind of, there's been no expression or understanding of those, of the roles and, wants, needs, desires, and the realities of younger teenage girls' realities, I suppose. I just wanted to kind of flag that, and I just want to link it back to the potential for all this to fall into this post-feminist model where things aren't even deemed in a political sort of, in a political light, really. And I wanted to take this example of MIA and Tommy Genesis recently selling Mercedes-Benz cars in a desert somewhere, and this being two strong young women who have an enormous number of political sort of there's politics and activism being part and parcel of who they are and where they're from, and their expression or how they see it, how they see the world. And again, I just wanted to kind of flag, you know, even that can be co-opted into a certain sort of, into another guise really, and helps to kind of sell or push a different sort of product or service, or, you know, a different ideology really with it. As Angela McRobbie would refer to it as a double entanglement of neoliberal values in relation to gender, sexuality and family life, and a feminism that once part of common sense, yet also feared, hated and fiercely repudiated. So it's this sort of, you know, incorporate and revise and depoliticize all sort of issues related to women and strong, you know, politically active and involved versions of feminism really, and different movements of that, and how everything can kind of be pulled into this post-feminist neoliberal model to sell product and to push product essentially. Again, like I said, it's just kind of snapshots that I want to pick off of, you know, where things are or can be going with a lot of this stuff. But again, you know, I will get at we'll talk about it a little bit now of like the dual end of that, where we look at, okay, there's different sort of movements in this, and there's, you know, really interesting takes on a lot of this stuff as well, where we look at like movements like the Femin movement and groups like the proto-punk band Pussy Riot, Ukrainian radical feminist activists who protect women's rights. And the organisation has become internationally known for organising topless protests against sex tourism, religious institutions, sexism, homophobia, and other social, national and international topics. So we see that this sort of, instantly we look at feminine, where the desirable body or the nude, and this sort of male gaze of that being totally obliterated and turned into, like, you know, a political action and a full kind of, what's the word we put on that? Just to take control of your own body and your own body identity, and to kind of, you know, ape patriarchy and that sort of male gaze onto it by turning it into, to weaponize your body, essentially. I suppose we wanted to look at it that way. And likewise with the Pussy Riot group, you know, playing with this sort of anonymous idea and being really playful about all those same elements. So you get two different sort of spheres of that. And so it's the vital thing I want to say about this is that it does play it in those same mediated cultures. It's using the same, you know, platforms, be it social media or, you know, music videos or photos or photo journalism. All these elements are kind of coming to play in this sort of light as well. So there is that duality of things kind of going in very many different directions, which is, you know, really interesting and worth flagging with that. If we look at the radical feminism end of it, you know, radical feminists assert that society is a patriarchy in which the class of men are the oppressors of the class of women. They propose that the oppression of women is the most fundamental form of oppression, one that has existed since the inception of humanity. So this kind of, you know, pushes past that in terms of it's active and it's a political action where it's not some sort of trying to persuade men to be allowed in to that or anything, you know, of those sort of lines, or anything that, you know, smacks of that post-feminism where it can be kind of finessed or managed into like some sort of acceptable situation that, you know, that is acceptable, I suppose, just to look at it in those lights, and has kind of moved past that as well. And, you know, there's a real essentialist side to radical feminism in terms of like looking at it since, you know, inceptions of humanity, and how that, you know, it being a form of oppression in all its shapes, forms and guises. And that's something to be fought, actually, you know, and that's all that kind of boils down to. Within that, there's just a kind of, you know, caveat, which we'll talk about again, I suppose, in the queer discourse lecture next, would be, you know, the trans exclusionary radical feminism. So there's a lot of this, you know, there's elements of that where, you know, including trans people who identify as women into that, and cis privilege being a base of, you know, just, you know, an essentialist side of what if you were born a man, then it doesn't particularly, you know, it not really accounting that you then, you know, you identify as a woman. And and that being something exclusionary, which is one element, which is kind of an interesting discussion within radical feminist theory and thinking now, of this exclusionary radical feminist thinking, which excludes trans people from those sorts of rights, or, you know, the same attainments that, you know, radical feminist women are actively, you know, fighting for. And that being another element, really, you know, it's a case of just, it's a really, I suppose, a more advanced thing. And I just wanted to kind of lead into, you know, the next slide by just flagging that, really, just to show how far out this can go in terms of speculative feminism, ecofeminism, post-humanism, and post-gender. And someone, a really interesting, you know, feminist theorist on this, Donna Haraway, who wrote the Cyborg Manifesto in the 70s, and then more recently, you know, the books like The Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin, Not Babies. And this sort of like, these are like bringing it to, you know, a more interconnected nature of social categorization, such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to a given individual or group. You know, that's regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of, you know, and that being a kind of a more, I suppose, broader, in a lot of ways more scientific base for these discussions, where roles such as race, gender, you know, human, are all sort of up for debate and up for discussion, really, and where they all kind of fit together, being kind of vital issues within that. So I just want to put one slide towards that, where it's hard to kind of to really pick off a small part of Donna Haraway in particular, or this sort of, you know, this speculative feminism or theory, or post-humanist, post-gender theory into one place. But this just one sort of a quick video about that, which might kind of expand some of these issues.
Now, the sciences of the Anthropocene also work not just in the system science way, but also particularly in their evolutionary biology trajectories, through competition equations, through taking molecules, cells, organs, tissues, individuals, populations, species, nesting units like Russian dolls, and relating the pre-established units to each other through competition equations, usually with the mathematics of zero-sum games, not always. But units and relations are the stuff of the scientific practices of the modern synthesis in evolution, and it has been extremely powerful, and brought genetics and Darwinism together, all kinds of really important things. But precisely what the sciences of the Anthropocene, these units plus relations, could not and did not deal with, were symbiosis, the bacterial world, complex collaborative behavior, and developmental biology, the kind of movement of form into the future, which is a fair amount not to be able to deal with very well in biology. Okay? I think one of the things that gives me the most inspiration these days is the fact that the biological sciences, instrumentalized both by system sciences and digital apparatuses, by biomolecular visualization apparatuses, by biomolecular chemistry, so on, instrumentalized in a way that has really changed the game in all areas of scientific practice, of biological practice, but has enabled the empirical and theoretical establishment of the fact that being alive on Earth is a question of symphoesis, of becoming with, that at every level of the onion, including the origin of the modern cell, which could be figured, Lynn Margulis did it this way, as two bacteria eating each other and getting indigestion, so that neither could quite assimilate the other, and a more complex kind of cellular organization of partial inclusion, partial exclusion, changes the organizational name of the game of life on Earth, and the modern cell is the result, the cell with the nucleus and the membranes and the rest of the mitochondria and the rest of it. That the origin of modern cellularity is the result of indigestion, not sex. And indeed, by far the most change in the biological world the most organizational change in the biological world has come about through indigestion compared to sex. Really kind of a minor theme.
Okay, so yeah, just wanted to kind of put some element of that in there just to point to how sophisticated a lot of this discussion is happening at in terms of developmental biology or towards a future of that or an understanding of it, and how all that really relates to, you know, so as a scientific first principle or essentialist, you know, origin story of how things have kind of come about, and this being completely intertwined with technology, because the more advanced the technology becomes, the more can be understood about, say, origins or these sorts of other elements. Was really interested in terms of the you know, this speculative feminism or post-gender, post-humanist sort of take on things, or cyber feminism, is the, you know, the foreground of the interconnected nature of social sort of categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, and how that's regarded as creating an overlapping and independent systems. You know, that's one element which I kind of wanted to pull on from where we're looking at, you know, and expanding on even intersectionality and, you know, this different takes on of gender and how gender is changing, and our understanding or perceptions of how that relates back to the real world, but also just in terms of it being, you know, all of these things combining to you know, expand on more inclusive, alternative, indigenous ways of reading and relating to other people and then to the world. Looking at like more indigenous communities, as I said, like matriarchal societies, redefining and removing and recreating fluid gender, and beginning to understand other animal and creature behaviors, and all this sort of combining to a more expansive idea of what is a human, essentially, or, you know, what is kind of contained within our cellular form. So, you know, the science fiction element of this is quite obvious, but what it does point to, I suppose, is just we look at like two kind of the potential for new tropes, I suppose, or different reworkings of tropes of like the role, what is a woman, you know, like these the two like the biggest blockbusters at the moment. We've new Blade Runner film where, you know, his girlfriend is a this billboard, 60-foot billboard hologram, which you can get in like, you know, in a kind of a USB key form size thing, and have, you know, a hologram for a girlfriend. But, you know, and what that says about, you know, to a male gaze or a perception of a woman, or what sensibilities of femininity need to apply to that, and that really kind of expands on those sort of ideas. Or likewise with you know, the Shape of Water and this sort of updated Beauty and the Beast story, where, you know, I suppose a post-human sort of take on it, or, you know, a different relationship with the stranger parts of the natural kingdom and the natural world, or all that just kind of embracing evolutions and different takes of it. So that's kind of, you know, that's really interesting, you know, new tropes and new kind of perceptions and realities that have come about. Again, how much of this will pass as like, you know, something more grist for a you know, a kind of a consumer's mill, and how much of it actually begins to assimilate into like really beginning to understand how far humans have come and what is equality and how it is attained for all people on Earth is the different story with that. Apologies, I'm going to run it over again. I really thought this was going to be a shorter lecture, but when I got halfway through it, I realized that it was probably the same length as before. So my apologies for kind of giving you that impression. That's pretty much it in terms of what I can kind of say and offer around that. Any questions or any comments on that, please do contact me around it. Next lecture will be on race discourse in digital multimedia. Okay, so thank you very much. Bye.